Excerpt of God Without Thunder by John Crowe Ransom, originally published in 1930. Is religion a cause or an effect when we look at its relation to the whole conduct of life? It is usual to take it as a cause, and a powerful cause too, for consider the usual meaning of religion. We mean by religion, usually, a body of doctrine concerning God and man. But the doctrine which defines God and man's relation to God is really a doctrine which tries to define the intention of the universe and man's proper portion within this universe. It is, therefore, his fundamental philosophy. It expresses the conviction he holds about his essential destiny, and it is bound to be of determining influence upon his conduct. In nearly every external respect, the conduct of life in the Western world has changed during modern times, for better or for worse, to a degree which is revolutionary. But while that change has been going on, it is interesting to inquire what religion has been doing. Religion seemed during this time to change very slowly, and very little. The scientific successes of Western man were rapidly altering his attitude toward the world, and altering the program which he elected to carry out for himself in the world. But these alterations evidently were taking place in spite of his religion. His doctrines continued to make about the same demands as ever upon his attitude and upon his program. Westerners, therefore, seemed to be submitting themselves to a curious dichotomy. Half of their minds was making a profession, which was one thing, and half was indulging in a practice, which was another. The inevitable result was that religion fell into disrepute, for on these terms it clearly did not have the force which had been claimed for it in determining conduct. But probably the simple matter of fact was that an original body of religious convictions was being progressively disbelieved, while other religious convictions were forming unconsciously, which would eventually rise to consciousness and call for expression. Inevitably, the time would come when men would have to profess the principles which really governed them, and leave off the painful effort of adaptation which was required when they said one thing and tried to make it mean another. That time has about come. The old doctrines are being more or less quietly dropped. The new doctrines are being more or less openly published. The war is nearly over, and the new doctrines have all but won. We are being invited now to abandon, frankly, a faith in which we really hadn't for a long time believed, and to subscribe to one in which we must have been believing very powerfully in secret, if our conduct means anything at all. I will have to be much more specific. The religion that is about to be superseded is Orthodox Christianity. But since nearly every variety of Christianity is capable of claiming that title, let us apply the term severely. Orthodox means the religion of the historically elder varieties that antedated modernism. Orthodoxy, the religion which now is losing in the Western world, is therefore such a religion as that of the Eastern or Orthodox Church. Perhaps a little less it is that of the Roman and Anglican churches, and perhaps still less that of several major nonconformist communions. From there, orthodoxy tapers off towards the vanishing point, by varying degrees which I could not define, into Unitarianism, into many local congregational units, into Christian Science, and into philanthropic societies with a minimum of doctrine about God, like the Young Men's Christian Association, welfare establishments, fraternal organizations, and Rotary. And what is the characteristic doctrine of orthodoxy which is losing its ground? We may as well put this quite concretely. The doctrine which is now becoming so antiquated with us is that of the stern and inscrutable God of Israel, the God of the Old Testament. The new doctrine which is replacing it is the doctrine of an amiable and understanding God. We wanted a God who wouldn't hurt us, who would let us understand him, who would agree to scrap all the wicked thunderbolts in his armament. And this is just the God that has developed popularly out of the Christ of the New Testament, the embodiment mostly of the principle of social benevolence and of physical welfare. The new religion makes this God the ruler of the world, reduces the God of the Old Testament to a minor figure in the Godhead, or even now and then expels him altogether. Such a religion as this is clearly the one which adapts itself to the requirements of our aggressive modern science. It is the religion proposed by the scientific party. It is characteristically occidental and modern, but as far as a religion can be, it is fundamentally irreligious or secular, both in its doctrine and in its works. The scientists, so much admired for the marvels they have worked, so very imposing in their unusual singleness of mind, have been steadily acquiring an ascendancy over public opinion. Their progress has been so regular that they have not generally found it necessary to resort to open battle with those who still defended the old doctrines, and the way of life which the old doctrines would have required of them. A change in religions is, of course, a revolution of the first importance in society, and might well be attended with violence. And, in fact, we've had a little of that. There was Dayton, Tennessee, which scared us with its revelation of the deep passions that might be involved. There is now the public religious conflict in communist Russia. But, on the whole, the new religion is on the point of having established itself in America, and in most Western societies perhaps, with unusual tact and with the minimum of outrage. The war has been fought now nearly to its finish. And yet it has been a war that grew more and more polite in its latter stages, with the purpose that at its conclusion nobody need openly admit defeat. Our historical orthodoxy was an aggregate of supernatural stories or myths. As soon as I make this statement, I remember painfully that there is a certain state of mind which will reply, "Myths are for children, and I am an adult, and I do not care to hear about your historical orthodoxy." Probably this state of mind is not of the advanced mental age it supposes, but here it is enough to say, myth is the mark of every religion that has functioned after the usual historical types. Our myths were taken partly from the Old Testament and partly from the New. We will examine in rather short order the part which was taken from the Old Testament, and which has to do with the question, who was the God of Israel? I would fix attention upon only a few leading features, the ones which seem most peculiarly Hebraic, and the most foreign to the temper of our Occidental modernism. I should add that our glance will have to be, so far as I'm concerned, that of a layman and not of an expert theologian. The old God distinguished himself from the new God in at least three important particulars. First, he was mysterious and not fully understood. There was no great familiarity with him which might breed contempt. Second, he was worshipped with burnt offering and sacrifice. And third, he was the author of evil as well as of good. Perhaps all these are correlative features which imply each other. There are probably sorcerers, magicians, and fakirs in the pay of every institutionalized religion, as its priests, and people who are taken in by them as its defrauded believers. I should certainly not undertake to find an exceptional religion where this fact would not obtain. Nevertheless, I do not think it a fair conclusion that the classes together constitute the Church. And now it is time to discuss fundamentalism. My own view is that all first-class religionists are fundamentalists, and that it is the fundamentalists, properly speaking, who constitute the Church. These fundamentalists, as I see it, do not believe in magic, and yet I would feel obliged to define them in the usual terms. The fundamentalists are those who regard their God as an actuality and treat their supernatural fictions as natural objects. How then is it possible to clear them of the usual reproaches heaped upon them by anthropologists? I will try to imagine the religious history of a good fundamentalist as a perfectly intelligent course of action. There seems to be nothing preposterous in that combination. The fundamentalist is a man who, in the first place, had the metaphysical acuteness to rise from the scientific laws to the principles. To get that far, he employed philosophy in its most ordinary kind of service. But he was not only a philosopher, for he had religious desires, and so he allowed his principles to take their spontaneous mythical forms. There was some courage and decision involved in this step, too. He had to release his imagination and honor the forms under which it represented the principles. And still he had not done all. The enjoyment of myths in general does not quite make a fundamentalist. The act that yet remained for him was to pick out of all the myths a particular one to profess and to keep. This act he performed, and at that stage he became our full-fledged fundamentalist. Much more might be written about the doctrine conveyed in the garden myth, as one which is embodied again and again in a whole tissue of Old Testament myths, while it remains itself the grandest of all embodiments. But I must make a more general point, which does not have to do directly with myths. The Scriptures do not consist only in histories, or myths, or doctrine. They are the work of a race of writers who loved nature, and a very large fraction of them consist in pastoral poetry, or a literature about nature. Religionists are almost invariably agrarians rather than industrialists. They find a God readily when they make contact with the elemental soil, and with more difficulty as their habitations and occupations increase in artificiality and in their distance from the soil. There is nothing mysterious in the curse which attaches to the artificial habitation and to the occupation with business rather than with agriculture. There is just one thing wrong with an artificial environment. It is much simpler than any natural one, and it produces in the man whom it environs a false illusion respecting the simplicity of nature. I will modernize a little. In the office room in which I write, the 6 enclosing surfaces, the doors, the lamps, the furniture, the shelves, and the books are, for the most part, of a severe rectilinear pattern, or at least of such geometrical and regular patterns as lend themselves to the easiest production by man's tools and processes. And they have textures which are smooth and homogeneous, another mark of the mechanical product. If I leave this room, I must walk through a building whose appointments are of the same simplicity. If I leave the building, I am in a city where I am almost as little in contact with nature. The streets are paved, the buildings are rectilinear, and the flora arrange themselves dutifully according to the prescriptions of the street commissioner and the park commissioner. The modern American city or industrial district is certainly the most impressive transformation of natural environment that has yet appeared on this planet. It is no wonder if it tickles its inhabitants so pleasantly with the sense of their ruthless domination of nature and the ease with which they can manage its God. But any city, even a small city of the old Jewish world, approaches this degree of transformation. Its effect is to insulate its inhabitants against observation of the fact which it is well for the realist to take always into account, the infinite variety of nature. The agricultural population is constantly aware of this fact, and accordingly its temper differs from the temper of industrialists and city folk. It is humble, religious, and conservative. Its God is inscrutable. The nature it knows is not the nature that the city folk think they have mastered. Neither in the manner of their habitations, nor in the forms of their occupation, do the city folk make contact with elemental nature. And if even the city folk are visited sometimes by an unaccountable nostalgia for the soil, and would like to return at weekends to visit the old nature from which they have emancipated themselves, they do it far too patronizingly. They do not really recover the old attitude towards nature. They only take what may be called a picnic view of nature. We have moved far from the habits of those days and those climates to which the Scriptures were congenial. Culturally, their language and their images seem strange to us now, and we have heard so much fun made of them. There is a real effort required now to enter into them sympathetically, even when we consider that metaphysically they are sound. Perhaps we would greatly relish, and indeed it is probable, that we are continually on the lookout to see if we will not discover somewhere a brand new myth, not shop-worn, not yet ridiculed, and not unrepresentative of what little taste we may have yet for the enjoyment of myths. But that is an event upon which it is impossible to make any calculations. A new religion being totally impracticable as a thing to propose, the only recommendation that it is in my power to make is this one. We had better work within the religious institutions that we have, and do what we can to recover the excellences of the ancient faith. The churches must be turned from their false gods towards the old, true gods, whenever and however and so far as this proves to be practicable. Is it possible, then, for all the religious institutions yet to be saved? There is undoubtedly a good deal of difference in their respective chances of obtaining this happiness. The further they have come from orthodoxy, the smaller their chances. But why should one not dispose of this vexing problem by saying ever so simply, let the West go into the Greek communion, where orthodoxy still largely prevails? Like other dispositions that are excessively simple, that solution is not in the least practicable. The West will scarcely do what I might ask in this matter. At best, only a few Westerners might do it. Where is this Greek communion? Where is this Greek communion? It is too far away from my part of the world, and I would have to expatriate myself to join it, or lead an immigration of a few like-minded fellow citizens to go and become Greeks. The only local example of a church of this faith with which I have had any actual acquaintance is situated in a Wyoming mining town. I cannot pronounce the names of its members. I can scarcely exchange with some of them any conversation in the same tongue, and I find very little in common with them except that, so far as I understand, I admire their gods. The thought of joining them is, in brief, abhorrent. Or why not advise the Western world to enter the synagogue, if the synagogue might be so kind as to receive it, and find the God of Israel in his greatest purity? Once more, and with all respect, the word suggests itself. Abhorrent, for better, for worse, a man is a member of his own race or his own tribe. He will have to prosper or suffer as it prospers or suffers. The religion that he requires must have the character of being his own social institution. If there is not a religious institution that suits him quite near at home, he will have to go without one. Besides, there might be some disagreeable questions to raise and answer. Would Judaism admit Christ the Logos into its Godhead, even in his subordinate capacity? And does Judaism still cherish the ancient God of Israel in his stern and inscrutable majesty? Or has Judaism softened him down and degraded him and identified him with its rather secular and commercialized existence? I will mention another possibility. Why should not the Western world go Roman? But again, that is too simple. My Western world does not want to do anything of the kind. The history of the Western world is a history of political separation from the Roman Church, which is now definitely a rejected polity, as well as a faith, and against which we have for a good many generations cultivated a powerful antagonism. We have prejudices, and if I, for my part, might overcome these prejudices, would my community as a whole do this also? I have friends, and I hear of men whose sound judgment I esteem highly, who are going back to Rome. Sometimes I may feel envious of their spiritual advantages. But the most of my friends and kind are not doing this, and will not. Therefore, I am not willing to do it, and neither will I advocate it. And next, why not bid the West go Anglican or Episcopal? I am now getting much nearer home, much nearer to the actual milieu in which I live. I am an Anglophile, and I wish my country might be more so. But I am not so Anglophile as I am American, and I find myself sometimes, as I find my neighbor more frequently, abhorring Anglicanism and episcopacy, for reasons perhaps that are social and political and inarticulate but deep, for inherited reasons. Therefore I propose no such thing. I still seek the religion that will be the expression of the social solidarity of my own community. There is Presbyterianism and Methodism and Baptistry. There are plenty of other sectarian possibilities. These bodies are evidently close to the genius of my kind of community, but they have declined rather far from orthodoxy as I see it, and as what Western religious body has not. They secularize themselves more and more every day. It is hard to give them an endorsement. There are two objectives at which the religious purpose of an intelligent private citizen has to drive. One is scarcely more important and indispensable than the other. But while it might be possible to realize one of them, it is, according to our present prospects, almost impossible to realize both of them at once. One is a religion to which the private citizen might by personal conviction be intensely loyal, with gods whom he may fear and love, and whose commandments represent for him the deepest wisdom. The other is simply a religion with the sanction of his own natural society behind it. Under these circumstances, it will be a bolder man than I who has an extremely specific or concrete proposal to offer to the Western cisatlantic world seeking its religious expression. I have already made the best suggestion I can. It is a comparatively tame one. It does not look in the least heroic, and it does not promise any quick and spectacular consequences. But I will repeat it, a little more fully, and it will have to be the only contribution that I know how to offer. With whatever religious institution a modern man may be connected, let him try to turn it back towards orthodoxy. Let him insist on a virile and concrete God, and to accept no principle as a substitute. Let him restore to God the thunder. Let him resist the usurpation of the Godhead by the soft, modern version of the Christ, and try to keep the Christ for what he professed to be, the demigod who had come to do honor to the God.